Brian Carter is a 21-year-old African-American male with a lean, powerfully built frame that speaks to years of disciplined martial arts training. Every step he takes is fluid and deliberate, his movements honed with precision and laced with quiet intensity. His dark brown skin gleams in the sun like polished bronze, a testament to both his strength and pride. Standing at 5 feet 10 inches, Brian often jokes it's the perfect height, not towering awkwardly, but far from short. His sharp eyes are always alert, holding a calm storm just beneath the surface, constantly reading the room, the terrain, the opponent. Confident, grounded, and fiercely loyal, Brian has the mindset of a warrior and the heart of someone who refuses to let others fall. Brian let out a long breath and adjusted his stance, rolling his shoulders as he stared down the brick wall of a man across from him. The crowd around the tournament ring buzzed like a hive of caffeinated bees. Smartphones hovered in the air, friends shouted over one another, and somewhere in the audience, someone played the Mortal Kombat theme on a Bluetooth speaker. He smirked. Semi-finals, baby. His opponent, a 6'5" slab of muscle named Greg the Reaper Holstein, cracked his knuckles like they owed him money. He looked like a human mountain, the kind you don't climb without proper permits. "Hey!" Brian said, bouncing on the balls of his feet. "You know they still test for steroids, right?" Greg didn't answer, just gave him the look. "You are going to need a dentist after I am finished with you look." Brian wasn't scared, not even nervous. He'd spent his whole life training. Martial arts was in his blood, not literally, no mystic kung fu lineage or secret scrolls, but because he loved it. The rhythm, the discipline, the challenge, the calm before the storm itself, and the moment after, when your opponent was on the floor wondering what just happened. The bell rang. Greg charged like a bull. Brian slid sideways like water, a step, a duck, a spin. Greg's fists whistled past his head. Brian countered with a rapid combo, jab to the ribs, kick to the knee, elbow to the shoulder, clean, smooth, fast. The crowd roared. Greg staggered back, face twisted with confusion and a little bit of rage. "I trained 6 years for this," Greg barked. Brian shrugged. "I trained while binge-watching Samurai Champloo. We all have our methods." Greg roared and lunged again, but Brian was already moving, reading the fight, adapting, flowing like a leaf in the wind. His foot connected with Greg's chest in a picture-perfect spinning sidekick. Boom. Greg hit the mat with a sound like a dropped couch. The crowd exploded. Brian grinned, panting lightly. One more win. The title was his. And then the floor disappeared. No warning, no flash of light, no swirling energy or chanting monks, just gone. 1 second he was standing victorious, the next, gravity yanked the ground out from under him. "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" He tumbled through a tunnel of light and leaves, his body flailing like a crash test dummy in a wind tunnel. Something that looked suspiciously like a unicorn flew past his head. He might have screamed, maybe, then whump. Brian hit the ground with a thud, leaves and dirt flying around him as he rolled into a crouch. His breathing steadied as he scanned the trees, eyes narrowing. The forest didn't look like it belonged anywhere on Earth. The sky above was lavender blue, streaked with twin suns and lazy white clouds. Maybe I am on Tatooine, he thought. The trees around him were towering things with golden leaves and bark like polished bronze. Ferns the size of cars rustled beside him, and flowers glowed softly in neon pinks and purples. The growling started low. Then came the glowing green eyes, 10 pairs peering at him from the dark brush. Wolves, no collars, no howls, just teeth and muscle and wild hunger. "Wolves, huh?" Brian muttered, flexing his hands. "All right, I've handled worse." He most definitely had not. They stalked forward, surrounding him like a hunting pack. Low growls turned to snarls. Then they pounced. Brian met them head-on. The first wolf lunged. He sidestepped and sent it crashing to the ground with a sharp kick to the ribs. A second charged from behind. Brian flipped over it, grabbed its scruff mid-air and slammed it into the ground. The third got close, jaws snapping. but he planted his heel square into its snout. 3 down. The 4th came in low and fast. Brian rolled under its leap and caught it with a brutal punch to its chest. 4. He was breathing hard now, arms burning from the effort, but still standing. The remaining wolves growled louder, circling again. Only something changed. The next time Brian looked for one, it was gone, melted into the darkness. Another shifted unnaturally, like smoke wrapping around bone. What the? One appeared to his left, stepping from a tree's shadow as if stepping through a doorway. Another flanked him, materializing from the dark like it had always been there. Okay, Brian muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. Not normal wolves. The wolves had stopped treating him like prey. Now they were hunting him like predators who knew better. The next one lunged from the shadows without a sound. He barely dodged, taking a grazing bite to the arm. He spun, but another wolf shimmered into view behind him, fangs gleaming. They were using the forest's darkness to vanish and strike without warning. Brian's senses strained. He listened for paw steps, rustling leaves, breathing, anything. He caught movement to the right, struck out fast, and landed a hit, but another wolf clipped his side, knocking him off balance. He was being worn down. Then, a thunderous clang split the forest air as a massive warhammer struck a shadow wolf mid-leap, sending the beast hurtling through the trees like a ragdoll. It slammed into a trunk with a sickening crunch and slid to the ground, motionless. Brian stumbled back, blood dripping down his fingers, chest heaving. He turned toward the source of the blow and saw a mountain of a man stomping into the clearing. The newcomer looked like a walking fortress. Dented iron armor clanked with each step, layered thick over broad shoulders and a barrel chest. His helmet was off, revealing a bearded face hardened by battle. In his hands, he held a warhammer that had seen many, many battles. Its weight alone was enough to break bones, and he wielded it like it was an extension of himself. And on his back hung the biggest shield that Brian had ever seen. The man gave Brian a quick once-over and grunted, "You all right?" Brian wiped blood from his mouth and flexed his fingers into fists. "Define all right." The man chuckled. The boy had spirit. Another growl rose from the dark. The wolves had regrouped. Brian and the tank locked eyes for half a second. No plan, no words. Then they moved as one. The next wolf lunged for Brian's throat. He pivoted, ducking low, and slammed his palm into its jaw, knocking it off course. As it staggered, Brian drove a knee into its gut, followed by a spinning back fist that sent it tumbling. A second wolf pounced from the right, but before it could reach him, the armored man stepped between them, lifting his hammer and slammed it into the ground. Boom! A shockwave rippled out from the impact, throwing a few wolves off their feet. Another tried to leap onto the tank's back and hit his shield. He ignored it and grabbed another wolf mid-air by the throat. It let out a loud growl, which changed to silence as it slammed into a tree. Meanwhile, Brian moved like a whirlwind. He was light on his feet, striking with surgical precision, aiming for joints, throats, and underbellies. He rolled beneath snapping jaws, using a wolf's momentum against it to flip it over his shoulder and into the dirt. When one got too close, he wrapped an arm around its neck and slammed his elbow into its skull until it stopped moving. "Left flank!" the tank bellowed. Brian didn't look. He trusted the voice. He ducked and dove to the side just as Elim's warhammer whooshed over his head and crashed into another wolf, splattering shadowy energy across the ground. The wolves tried to overwhelm them with speed and stealth, vanishing into the shadows and striking from all angles, but they couldn't pierce the tank's impenetrable defense or outmaneuver Brian's agility. One wolf lunged at Brian's back. He sensed it more than saw it, spun and leapt backward, vaulting off it as it collided with Elim's iron shield. Crack. The wolf collapsed. Elim didn't even flinch. Brian landed beside him, panting. "Not bad, hammer guy," Elim snorted. "You punch like a brawler." Brian grinned. "And you swing like an avalanche." They moved again. Brian led 2 wolves on a chase through the underbrush, ducking and weaving between trees, luring them into the open. As soon as they leapt, Elim stepped into view and met them with a two-handed, crushing blow that turned bones to splinters. Minutes passed. The forest echoed with growls, strikes, and battle cries. And then, silence. The last of the shadow wolves dissolved into fading mist, their magic dispersing into the cool forest air. The clearing was littered with the bodies of the beasts, twitching or still, their illusion magic broken. Brian stood proudly, hands on his waist, breath ragged. His shirt was torn, his fists swollen, and bruises lined his ribs. His arm was bleeding, but his eyes were bright. He looked over at the big man, who rested his hammer on his shoulder like it weighed nothing. "You always crash the party like that?" Brian asked between breaths, wiping sweat from his brow. Elim grinned beneath his beard, stepping over a very dead wolf. "Only when it looks like my friends are outnumbered." "I'm Elim," the man said, extending a hand. Elim is a towering sentinel even among warriors, 6 feet 5 inches and weighing nearly 260 pounds of solid, battle-hardened muscle. He is incredibly strong and just as kind. At 40 years old, this Caucasian male is a seasoned tank whose presence changes the tide of any battle. Years of fighting for justice have forged a man who refuses to yield, no matter the odds. "My name is Brian. From—" He paused, the words catching in his throat. Telling people he wasn't from this world probably wasn't the smartest move. In stories like this, world-hopping, monster-fighting kind of tales, outsiders kept that sort of thing quiet. You didn't spill secrets until you knew who you could trust. "From pretty far away," he finished with a small, awkward smile. Elim chuckled. "Nice to meet you, Brian, from pretty far away." His grin widened as he kept his hand out. Brian clasped it, matching the grip with equal strength. For a moment, Elim's eyes narrowed in pleasant surprise. "Solid grip," Elim said, nodding. "That tells me a lot." "Yeah? Like what?" Brian asked. "That you've got a warrior's heart," Elim said with a glint of respect, "and the strength to match it." Brian kept his feelings on that matter to himself. In this new world, what exactly did being a warrior consist of? Only time would tell. "Come on. Let's go somewhere safe. We can talk as we walk." Brian looked at Elim, his expression earnest. "I don't know much about this land, and I want to understand it better," he said. "But as for where I come from, I can't talk about that. Not yet." Elim nodded. As they made their way through the glowing woods, Elim explained the basics. The land was called Ordanis, and yes, monsters were real. Adventurers were mercenaries who kept the peace, took contracts, and generally tried not to get eaten. Brian listened, soaking it in like a sponge. He didn't panic. He didn't complain. He just walked beside Elim, nodding thoughtfully. "If you ever need to know something, just ask," the man said, clapping Brian on the shoulder with a heavy hand. Brian winced at the impact, then offered a crooked smile. "Thanks," he said, his voice dry but sincere. "I'll try not to get lost before I do." As twilight descended over the land, the road began to slope upward, curving gently through rolling hills, dotted with olive trees and golden wildflowers. Then, as they crested the final rise, the city of Greyhearth came into view. Even from a distance, it was breathtaking. "And that, my friend," Elim said with the pride of a man showing off his firstborn, "is Greyhearth, the largest city on the continent and the place we call home." Towering white stone walls shimmered in the fading sunlight, their smooth surfaces catching the last golden rays of dusk. Tall spires and delicate towers rose beyond the walls, silhouetted against a lavender sky. Banners of deep blue and silver fluttered from high parapets, bearing the city's crest, an open flame surrounded by a ring of stars. The gates themselves were a marvel, carved from pale wood reinforced with dark steel. They stood wide open, welcoming travelers and merchants alike. Guards in polished armor stood at attention, spears upright, their gazes calm but watchful. As Brian and his companion approached, a cool breeze swept over them, carrying with it the distant scent of baking bread, river water, and blooming night jasmine. Inside the city, Greyhearth was alive with motion and charm. Marble-paved streets wound through clusters of elegant buildings, stone homes with carved lintels, balconies overflowing with trailing ivy, and iron lanterns beginning to glow with flickering orange light. Water channels cut through parts of the city, reflecting the lanterns and moonlight in a soft dance of ripples. Artisans packed up their market stalls, children chased each other between fountains, and street performers gave their final bows to small crowds gathered near quiet plazas. The soundscape was a blend of laughter, music, and the gentle rhythm of a city settling in for the night. They passed a towering amphitheater, its archways lit with glowing crystals. A temple with a domed roof sparkled with inlaid mosaics. It all felt like something from a dream, ornate, well-ordered, and quietly powerful. Eventually, as the main thoroughfare gave way to smaller cobbled lanes, the group reached a quieter district nestled at the edge of a shimmering lake that reflected the entire city like glass. Here the stone gave way to wooden beams and flower boxes. A cozy village atmosphere lingered at the city's edge, blending rural calm with urban elegance. Lanterns hung from curved iron posts along cobblestone paths, their amber light casting warm halos across the street. Birds chirped their final songs of the day from the rooftops, and laughter spilled out from a handful of open windows. Ahead stood a welcoming three-story inn. Its whitewashed walls were trimmed in dark oak, and a painted wooden sign creaked gently in the breeze. Golden light and the smell of roasted meats and cinnamon bread drifted out from the open windows. Finally, Elim muttered, cracking his neck, "Home, sweet home." Brian smiled and stepped through the door, taking one last look at the city behind him. Greyhearth had greeted them like a queen, graceful and proud, but inside this beauty, he could already sense layers of secrets and stories waiting to be uncovered. Inside, the warmth and smell of stew hit Brian like a hug. Elim led him to a round table where three figures waited: a spry older dwarf nursing a mug, a kindly human woman in healer's robes, and a stunning elf with icy blue-green eyes that could kill a man at 20 paces. "This is Harnock, Listra, and Freya," Elim introduced. Harnock is a 300-and-something-year-old male dwarf magician, stout of frame and sharp of wit. Standing at just under 5 feet tall with a broad, muscular build, his thick auburn beard is streaked with silver, a testament to both his age and arcane experience. As a spellcaster, he wears a reinforced mage's coat, layered in dark leather and stitched with runic threads, providing both protection and channeling power. His braces are inscribed with elemental glyphs, and his belt clinks with potions and magical components. Harnock's piercing green eyes gleam with intelligence and mischief, often accompanied by a dry quip or a sarcastic remark. Despite his gruff exterior, he is very friendly and is loyal to the core, brave in battle, and fiercely protective of his companions. His magic is potent, precise, and often explosive, much like his personality. Harnock waved. "New blood, eh? We'll see how long you last." Listra moved to Brian without a word, her steps light but purposeful. She gently placed her hand on his cheek, and a soothing warmth spread through him. The stinging scrapes and minor bruises from the fight faded almost instantly, melting away under her touch. "Listra is our resident healer," Elim said, folding his arms with a nod of pride. "And a damn good one," Harnock added with a grin. "Ain't that right, lass?" Listra is a 40-year-old human healer and the compassionate core of the group. Standing at 5 feet 7 inches with a warm, sturdy presence, she balances gentle wisdom with a fierce sense of duty. Her brown hair is usually tied back in a simple braid, and her hazel eyes always seem to be reading more than what's spoken aloud. Her gear is practical, built for movement and protection, and she carries a polished staff and a well-worn satchel full of potions, salves, and emergency traps. Listra is kind, motherly, and always willing to put herself at risk to help others, but make no mistake. When danger threatens her friends, she will do whatever she can to help them. Her presence is steady, her guidance invaluable, and her quiet strength is the glue that keeps the party from falling apart. But Listra didn't respond. She was fully focused, her eyes distant, as if she were drawing his pain into herself and replacing it with something calm, gentle, almost motherly. Her touch wasn't just healing. It was comforting in a way that made Brian feel seen. Within half a minute, he felt completely restored, like the fight had never happened. "And what about you?" she asked, turning to Elim. "I'm fine, Lissy," he said, waving a hand. "Didn't take a single hit." "Good to hear," she said, returning quietly to her seat and picking up a worn, leather-bound book without another word. Elim and Harnock exchanged a knowing look and smiled. "She lives to serve," Elim said softly, watching her with quiet respect. "I came across Brian in the forest today. He was holding his own against a pack of shadow wolves. Handled himself better than most seasoned fighters would. I'd say he's more than earned a shot at joining our team." Freya crossed her arms. "He looks green. He'll get us killed." Freya is an elven archer of unmatched grace and haunting beauty, eternally youthful in appearance though well over 600 years old. Standing around 5 feet 9 inches, her slender, athletic frame is the epitome of lethal elegance. Every motion deliberate, fluid, and balanced with quiet power. Her long, silver-blonde hair often spills from beneath a hooded green cloak, framing sharp, angular features and piercing blue-green eyes that rarely reveal what she's thinking. As the party's long-range specialist, she wears supple, forest-toned leather armor, fitted close to her body to allow swift, silent movement through woods or battlefield. Her figure, curved and sculpted like the bow she wields, is both arresting and intimidating, though her demeanor is cool and aloof. Freya speaks little, prefers solitude and trusts few, but behind her cold exterior lies a warrior of deep discipline, loyalty, and hidden emotion. She is the sharpest eye in the party, and when her arrows fly, few enemies live to see a second shot. Brian blinked. "Wow, I am right here. Just tell me how you really feel." The others laughed. Freya didn't. She turned to Elim. "He's not ready. We need someone who won't die screaming when things get real." Brian raised a hand. "Hi, still here. Not a fan of screaming. Unless it's in horror movies." Again, Freya didn't laugh. She just sized him up and walked away. Brian leaned over to Listra. "Does she smile, or was that surgically removed?" Listra whispered. "I've known her 10 years. Still waiting." Harnock chuckled into his mug. "Most guys don't know how to handle her." Brian shrugged. "I grew up sparring with girls who could snap my spine like a Kit Kat. I'll manage." Elim grinned. "Well, Brian, you've had a rough first day, but you've also lived. That's more than some manage." Brian tapped his finger on his mug. "So, what was that about me joining your group?" Elim clapped Brian on the back with a hearty laugh. "You see, we've been on the lookout for a fifth for a while now. Someone to help us hit a little harder, especially when things get dicey. And while you are a bit green, as our ever-tactful archer pointed out," he gave Freya a side glance and grinned, "I see a lot of promise in you." Harnock leaned forward, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "So, lad, the question is, would you be interested in trying out with us for a few days? See how we work together?" Brian smiled, lifting a glass of water. No alcohol yet. He needed to stay sharp. To new friends, a new city, shadow wolves, and warrior elves with murder eyes. Freya arched an eyebrow, but said nothing. The others chuckled as they raised their mugs in kind. The fire crackled, the air was warm, and for the first time today, something about the path ahead felt right. Brian woke up the next morning in a bed that wasn't his. That fact alone wasn't unusual. He'd slept on tournament floors, cheap hotel mattresses, and once in a karate dojo broom closet after an all-night training binge. But this bed had a pillow stuffed with actual goose feathers and sheets that smelled like lavender and… was that roasted chestnut? He blinked at the wooden beams above his head. No buzzing lights, no HVAC hum, no city noise, just the sound of birds chirping and something that sounded suspiciously like a goat bleating in the distance. "Oh, right," he muttered, sitting up. "Not a dream. Definitely not a dream." He looked down at himself. His gi was gone, replaced with simple traveling clothes. Brown leather boots, sturdy green trousers, and a tunic with laces at the neck that made him feel like an extra in Game of Thrones. There was also a dagger on the nightstand. Brian picked it up, studied the worn hilt, and whispered, "Not a bad starter weapon." His stomach growled like a wild beast he was starving. He stepped into the hall and followed the smell of food downstairs into the tavern. The Spotted Fawn was lively this morning, adventurers eating, laughing, bragging about their recent kills. A bard in the corner played a soft tune on a stringed instrument that looked like a guitar had a baby with a harp. At a corner table sat Elim, Harnock, Listra, and Freya, already polishing her bow with an intensity usually reserved for villain monologues. "Morning, hero," Elim said, pushing a bowl of porridge toward him. "Eat up. Big day ahead." Brian sat, eyeing the food. "Smells better than it looks. But then again, I've eaten gas station sushi before, so I'm basically invincible." Listra chuckled. "Glad you're still with us." Harnock raised a mug. "To surviving the forest of teeth on your first day." Brian blinked. "Wait, that's what it's called?" "Yes," Freya said, not looking up. "Because of the wolves." Brian grimaced. "Good to know." He dug into the porridge. It was surprisingly good. He listened as the others talked. They had a rhythm, a natural flow. They'd clearly been a team for years. And yet, there was an obvious gap, an empty space at the table, a fifth seat, which he was sitting in. "So," Brian asked, between bites, "am I like the rebound guy?" Elim blinked. "What?" "Well, clearly your squad used to have 5 people. I'm filling in. Is this an internship? Are there benefits? Dental?" Harnock barked a laugh. "No benefits, lad. Just blood, bruises, and the occasional celebration if you don't die horribly." "All right," Brian said, shoveling porridge into his mouth between words. "I'm ready to go whenever you are." Freya rolled her eyes. Listra smiled. "He's got heart. That's something." "Told you," said Elim. "Heart gets people killed," said Freya flatly. Brian held up a spoon. "Correction, untrained hearts get people killed. I'm a fast learner." "We'll see," she said, standing. "If he's coming, I want to see what he can actually do. Let's go." Brian watched her stalk out of the tavern. "Does she always do that dramatic exit thing?" he asked. Elim nodded. "Most days."
Should this tale please thee, consider liking and subscribing, lest the algorithm forget we ever crossed paths.
The group led Brian to a wide, dusty clearing just beyond the edge of town. The area looked like it had seen its fair share of action. Burn marks scorched the earth, weapon racks lined the edges, and a few shattered training dummies were scattered like battlefield relics. A half-buried helmet stuck out of the dirt like a warning. "This is the grindstone," Elim said. "We train here," said Harnock. "We test here," added Listra. "We weed out dead weight here," said Freya, her icy blue-green eyes staring at him. "And I'm here to prove I'm not expired lunch meat," Brian replied, rolling his shoulders. Elim gave a short, amused grunt. "We'll see." Harnock jabbed a stubby finger at Brian, his eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. "Today's your evaluation. After that, we'll take you on a few real quests. We'll be watching, closely, every move, every choice. We want to see exactly what you're made of." Brian gave a half grin, summoning whatever enthusiasm he had left. "Right. No pressure then." Freya didn't blink, her gaze locked on him like a drawn arrow. "Yes, Pressure, lots and lots of pressure. Brian blinked back at her. Great, love the encouragement. They started with brute strength. Elim had Brian lift a pair of weighted stone logs and walk them across the yard. Then came shield work, holding his ground against Elim's relentless shoulder checks and hammer swings. Brian gritted his teeth, digging in, every muscle screaming. But he didn't go down. Elim gave him a rare nod. Strong foundation, solid core. You've done this kind of training before. Kind of, Brian said between breaths. I wrestled a fridge once. Freya didn't speak. She just gestured toward a row of targets, wooden circles on ropes, swaying gently in the wind. She handed Brian a set of weighted daggers and stepped back. Hit these targets while they are in motion. The other three just kinda looked at each other with a knowing look. Brian frowned. While they are in motion. It kinda feels like they should be stationary. No reply. Just the silent, judging eyes of the elf. He threw the daggers at the targets. The first dagger clipped a target. The second missed entirely, and so did the third. Freya blinked, unimpressed. Again. They repeated the drill. This time Freya joined in, firing arrows alongside his throws, making it harder to track the targets. Brian did worse the second time. Poor precision, Freya said finally. You fail. Brian shrugged. I prefer punching things. She scowled at him and walked off. Next came agility and speed, and Harnock was practically bouncing with excitement. I've been waiting for this, the dwarf said, spinning fireballs in his palms. Just dodge. Wait. Dodge what? The first fireball screamed toward Brian's chest. He ducked, rolled, sprang sideways. Another blast scorched the air above his head, then another, and another. Brian moved on instinct, vaulting, sliding, flipping. It wasn't clean, but it was fast and fluid. He slipped through the barrage with dancer-like grace, though by the end his breath was ragged and his shirt singed. Harnock lowered his hands, eyes gleaming. That was beautiful. Thanks, Brian gasped. Next time, maybe start with a warning? Where's the fun in that? Finally, they ran him through an obstacle gauntlet. Rope climbs, sandbag carries, sprint intervals, uphill runs. Brian gave it his all, but it was clear that his all didn't last long. By the end of the third lap, he was doubled over, chest heaving, arms shaking. Listra handed him a flask. Endurance needs work. Lots of work, Freya muttered, scowling as she slung her bow over her shoulder. He's greener than spring moss, slower than a slurak slug. I've seen blind men with better aim. She crossed her arms, eyes narrowing to icy slits. And don't get me started on his endurance. A newborn baby could outlast him. She paused, then shook her head. No, scratch that. He's got the endurance of an unborn baby. She turned on her heel, already walking away. Try not to let his incompetence rub off on the rest of you. And with that, she vanished into the trees, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. She is not wrong, Brian said, flopping onto a training mat. All things I will have to fix. Harnock grimaced. And how do you plan on doing that? I will figure it out, he said confidently. Now one last test, Harnock said, pulling a small rune-inscribed stone from his pouch. Let's see if you've got a spark. Spark? Asked Brian, meaning if you have an affinity for magic, said Listra. Brian held the stone excitedly. Focus, Harnock instructed. Feel for the current inside you. It's like catching a fish with your soul. Brian closed his eyes. He focused. He clenched. He breathed. Nothing. Brian looked at the stone. Is it supposed to hum, glow, warm up, anything? Usually, yes, Harnock said. For you? Nada. You're magically bankrupt. Brian frowned. So no spells? Elim chuckled. Stick to your fists, lad. You've got plenty of punch without the spark. By the time the sun had started to set, Brian lay flat on his back, drenched in sweat, muscles sore, mind reeling. You survived, Listra said with a warm smile, handing him a cup of cool water. Barely, he croaked. Ah, don't be so hard on yourself, said Listra. We all started at the bottom. Elim folded his arms. But you've got something special. Fire in your belly and fortitude. Nothing in the magic department, Harnock added. But hey, not everyone is perfect. Understood, Brian replied. Time to get serious. The sun dipped low behind the sandstone towers of Greyhearth, casting a golden haze over the city as Brian wandered the bustling cobblestone streets. After the grueling trials, the group had agreed to take a well-earned break, and Brian, still buzzing from adrenaline and curiosity, decided to finally explore. The city was alive in a way the forests and ruins never were. Music echoed through narrow alleys, lute strings, hand drums, and a strange flute that sounded like a bird calling at dusk. Lanterns flickered to life as shopkeepers lit candles and crystals, bathing the roads in warm amber hues. But even as the city's vibrant energy surrounded him, Brian's thoughts drifted inward. He'd survived, barely, and that wasn't good enough. Sure, he could fight, but not for long. His stamina gave out way too quickly. That last test proved it. Every punch and dodge burned more than it should have, and by the end, he was running on fumes. And his aim, don't even get started. Freya had nearly laughed out loud when he tried to hit a fast-moving target. Even his footwork could use polish. Against foes like shadow wolves, being strong wasn't enough. He had to be sharp, unpredictable, focused, relentless, just to name a few. As he passed a group of city guards jogging in formation, he nodded to himself. Stamina comes first. He could train that anywhere. Running, hill climbs, sprints. He needed to move like Freya, fast and silent. He'd start at dawn. Precision would take longer. Maybe some kind of ranged weapon? Throwing knives, maybe. Something to help train his reflexes, his hand-eye coordination. He'd ask Harnock or maybe even one of the blacksmiths in the city for help. Maybe they could make him some practice apparatus. And strength? Elim was like a walking siege engine. Brian wasn't sure if he could ever match that raw power, but there was no rule that said he couldn't try. Maybe weightlifting, or maybe weighted clothes like Goku, or the weights on the arms and legs like Lee from Naruto. Brian's nose drew him back, pulling him out of his thoughts. Smoke curled from food carts packed along the main square, meats sizzling over open flames, spices wafting from bubbling stews, skewers glazed with sweet sauces. He stopped at a vendor grilling something that looked suspiciously like a cross between a rabbit and a turkey. "What's this?" Brian asked. The vendor, a portly woman with twinkling eyes and arms dusted in spices, smiled. "Smoked dusk beast, marinated in firefruit juice, tender enough to fall apart in your mouth. First one's free for first-timers." He took a bite and immediately groaned. The meat was smoky, spicy, and oddly citrusy, with a heat that built slowly in his throat. "That's insane," he muttered, going in for another bite. "Careful," she warned, laughing. "Too much, and you'll be dancing like a heat wasp." As he wandered further, Brian found himself drawn to a crowded plaza where street performers dazzled the locals, fire breathers, jugglers with glowing knives, and a young man who made shadow puppets that moved like they had minds of their own. Children clapped, elders smiled, and the scent of fried pastries lingered thick in the air. Then came the music taverns. The Moonvale Lounge caught his eye first. It had sheer silk curtains fluttering at the entrance and a warm glow inside. The bard's voice, soft, rich, and haunting, spilled into the street. Inside, people sipped colored drinks from glass orbs and leaned close to talk in low, lazy tones. Brian caught glimpses of velvet dresses, golden arm cuffs, and long, elegant fingers curled around wine glasses. He stood at the door, hesitating. That's when he noticed her. A tall woman with copper skin and jet-black hair twisted in a braid, seated near the window, watched him with mild amusement. Her dress shimmered like the night sky, and her eyes held a challenge. She raised a glass to him in a silent toast, before returning to her conversation. Brian blinked, then smiled. He didn't enter, just gave her a respectful nod and moved on, heart pounding a little faster. Later, he ended up at a quieter corner of the city, where an old man was sketching the skyline with charcoal. Brian sat next to him without a word and just watched, the stars blooming overhead, the buildings lit from within, and the city humming with life and secrets. He thought again of the trials, of how far he had to go. He was not satisfied with where he was, but now he had a plan. He was going to go back to basics and really train hard. Greyhearth wasn't just a place to survive in, it was a place to grow, and maybe, just maybe, to become unstoppable. The caravan rolled out just before sunset 2 days later. It was supposed to be a simple job, bread and butter, as Elim called it. Escort a merchant convoy from Greyhearth to the outpost village of Yarrow's Rest, a half-day's journey through forest roads. Brian was promised a taste of real field work. "This isn't glorious," Elim had said, strapping on his massive tower shield. "But it's necessary. Keeps us in the good graces of the trade guild." "And the trade guild pays in coin," Harnock added, wagging his eyebrows. "Which pays for drinks, which pays for forgetting the jobs that weren't so easy." "Cheery," Brian muttered. They met their charges outside the south gate of Greyhearth. There were 4 merchants in total. All were human, though wildly different in size and temperament. Borin, a balding, overweight man who smelled faintly of garlic and sweat, drove the lead cart. He was loud, superstitious, and convinced every squirrel they passed was a shape-shifted thief. Marla, in the second cart, was older, wiry, and had a voice like a rusty hinge. She carried a short sword at her side and kept a crossbow in her lap, for varmints, beast or man. Jules and Nettie, a young couple newly licensed by the guild, drove the third and final cart. They were impossibly cheerful and kept asking questions like, "What's the difference between goblins and kobolds?" and "Can you milk a wyvern?" Brian pondered the second question. Maybe a wyvern was milkable, but the real question was there anyone stupid enough to try? He was sure there were some pots out there that would be willing to. He smirked silently. The caravan's cargo was mostly practical. Crates of cloth, iron tools, glass vials, a few jars of enchanted lamp oil, and barrels of grain. But the third cart had something more precious. 4 chests of refined mana crystals, sealed by a trade sigil. Freya was at the front of the caravan, a perfect place for her, with her deadly precision and keen senses. Listra was on the left, and Harnock on the right. "Why are we not in the front?" Brian asked as they took position near the rear of the cart with the sealed chest. "Because if they hit, they usually spring their trap from the back," Elim said. "The rear is usually the weakest point, because that is usually where the best stuff to steal is," he added, nodding at the chest. "Cool," Brian said. "Love being bait. For the first hour, it was almost pleasant." The orange glow of the setting sun filtered through the trees. Crickets chirped. The wheels of the carts squeaked rhythmically. Brian almost forgot they were guarding high-value goods that goblins would kill for. Almost. Then came the smell. "Anyone else smell wet dog and vinegar?" Brian asked, wrinkling his nose. Freya had an arrow knocked before he finished the sentence. "Ambush," she said. "Close." The attack came fast. A screech from the tree line. Shadows burst forth. 18, maybe 20 goblins, wiry and snarling, armed with rusted blades and crude shortbows. They moved in coordinated waves, unusual for their kind. The first arrows came in a deadly volley. Freya loosed 3 arrows before they landed, each hitting its mark with surgical precision. One goblin tumbled from a tree like a pinwheeled ragdoll. Another took an arrow to the throat and dropped, twitching. Harnock stepped forward, bracing his feet. "Tempest Fang," he bellowed. A surge of lightning crackled from his staff and ripped through 2 goblins, their weapons flying as they convulsed in mid-air. Marla let out a cackle. "Get 'em, bearded thunderboy." 3 goblins rushed the last cart. Elim moved like a battering ram, shield raised high. 1 goblin bounced off his tower shield with a thunk like a melon hitting pavement. Another tried to stab low. Elim kicked him in the chest hard enough to send him flying 5 feet. "Get to cover!" he bellowed to the newly minted couple, who screamed and tossed a jar of pickled onions at a goblin. It shattered uselessly. "Helpful," Brian muttered. 2 more goblins tried to attack from the other side. Brian darted towards them, crouching low, just as 2 arrows whizzed past. He snatched a rock from the road and flung it with precision, clocking 1 goblin in the temple. The creature stumbled and went down hard, and Brian smiled. "Lack of precision," he muttered in a snobbish tone, mimicking Freya's voice under his breath. "Fail," she'd say. If only she could see me now. And then he froze. To his absolute horror, Freya was in fact seeing him now. Arrow knocked, 1 brow raised, her piercing stare colder than a frost-covered grave. Brian felt the chill crawl down his spine like ice water in winter. He swallowed hard and immediately shut his mouth, eyes forward, pretending nothing had ever been said, not another word. His training took over. He flowed between strikes, knocking a goblin's dagger aside with his forearm and snapping a jab into its nose. The goblin screamed and slashed wildly, but Brian ducked, rolled, and swept its legs. An arrow arched toward the excited Nettie, who was interested in seeing the fight. Brian leapt, literally leapt, catching the arrow mid-air with his right hand. "Ow, okay, that was dumb," he muttered, shaking his stung fingers. The remaining archer goblins were retreating to the rocks, where they would have cover and elevation. "Freya," Brian called. "They're regrouping above." She was too busy covering the front to help. Brian scanned the field and then sprinted toward a half-crumbled stone wall to the right of the road. He climbed like a cat, using broken ledges and roots as footholds. The goblins noticed too late. 1 aimed a bow. Brian twisted in the air, kicked off a ledge, and landed between 2 of them with a crunch of gravel. The first one lunged. Brian ducked low and drove his palm up into its jaw. It flew back, yowling. The second slashed. Brian grabbed its wrist, twisted, and used its own momentum to flip it off the ledge. "Tell your friends," Brian yelled after it, panting. Below, the last of the goblins were retreating into the forest, leaving behind a field of groaning bodies and twitching limbs. Brian sat on a large, flat stone just off the roadside, sucking in air like a winded boxer between rounds. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, revealing a nasty gash where a goblin blade had grazed him. Blood ran down his arm in thin, dark rivulets. I found a new respect for sharp objects," he muttered. Listra knelt beside him without a word, her healer's satchel already open. She wore a calm, focused expression that was oddly soothing, like a nurse who'd stitched up hundreds of foolish men before him, and probably had. "Hold still," she said. Brian started to respond with a joke, something witty about not going anywhere, but then her hands began to glow with soft golden light. It felt like warm sunlight on his skin, a gentle radiance that poured over the wound. The pain dulled instantly. He stared as torn flesh began to knit itself together, the bleeding stopped, and bruises faded like morning mist. "That's... whoa," Brian whispered. "Okay, that's cheating. You're a cheat code in human form." Listra smirked. "You wouldn't last 10 minutes out here without a healer. Most rookies don't." "I'm honored to be most rookies," he replied, still watching the magic work in awe. "Seriously, though, that's amazing. I studied for years in the Temple of Saranel. Healing is part art, part divine focus, part reminding grown men not to get themselves stabbed." Brian grinned. "I didn't try to get stabbed. It just happened. You know, like rush hour or heartbreak." She chuckled softly, her fingers hovering over a smaller scratch near his ribs. "Hold still. This one's shallow, but I'll get it anyway." He paused for a moment, watching her work. "You're really good at this," he said, more sincerely this time. "Thanks." "You're welcome," she said, her voice softer now. You jumped in front of a volley of arrows to protect the couple. That wasn't reckless. That was brave. There's a difference. Brian looked down. For all his bravado, the compliment caught him off guard. Well, he said with a shrug, I figured I should at least try not to let my party die in the first week. Listra looked at him with that same soft smile. We made the right call bringing you along. I thought this was just a test run. It is, she said, finishing the healing and gently letting go of his arm. But tests tell you who people are. Brian flexed his shoulder. No pain, no stiffness, just smooth, unbroken skin. Magic is nuts, he said. I stubbed my toe back on Earth and it ruins my whole day. You just fixed me like I was a broken action figure. Listra laughed. You're strange, Brian. Thank you. I try. Freya passed nearby, giving them both a glance and a quiet, Brian leaned toward Listra and whispered, Did she just scoff in Elvish, or am I picking up passive-aggressive vibes in stereo? She always scoffs, Listra said with a smirk. But she noticed your moves. That's something. Let's hope my moves keep impressing her, or at least keep me from getting sliced up again. You do your job, Brian, Listra said, standing up and offering him a hand, and I'll keep doing mine. He took it, letting her pull him to his feet. Deal. They walked back to the group together, the carts ready to roll again. The sun had dipped low beyond the trees, but the path forward felt a little brighter. He felt like an adventurer,